Hey, tonight we are looking at Sigmund Freud, his natal chart, and he was born on May 6th, 1856, and it's 1830. I got that time from Astrology, and that was local mean time, and my pronunciation, Pribor, Freiburg, and Moravia, I believe. So excuse if my pronunciation is wrong. For the purposes of this chart, to get the near exact degree of the rising sign in the midheaven, I've used universal time. So although it's 16:30 p.m. local time to where Freud was born in the Czech Republic, there you can see we've actually have a time of 1724 universal time. So Sigmund Freud, born on the 6th of May, 1856, in what is now the Czech Republic. So what I mentioned just a moment ago was the original name of the place he was born. He was the firstborn of his mother, Amalia, and his father, Jacob, was 20 years older than his mother. And it was the complex, triangulated family dynamic that would shadow his entire theatrical framework. The family moved to Vienna when he was 3 or 4 years old, and he spent most of his life there. And he married somebody called Martha Bernays in 1886, and he had 6 children and built the beginnings of psychoanalysis in the consulting room at Bergazia 19, again, excuse my pronunciation, in 1938, when the Nazi annexation of Austria, he was forced to flee to London, and he died in Hampstead on the 23rd of September, so September 23rd, 1939, having asked his physician to administer morphine. He was in agony from oral cancer and could no longer think or work, and he died as he had lived on his own terms, with absolute clarity about what he would and would not endure. So when you look at his chart, what we can see immediately here is we've got the Scorpio rising. And this is not a chart of somebody that lives comfortably in the sunlit world, in a chart that pulls everything downward. You know, he's got a lot of stuff going on the Chiron down here, and he's hasn't got, you know, much. He's got a bit at the top of his chart, but he's got Saturn and the moon in the 8th house there. So as you can see, it pulls everything downward, inward, towards what is concealed, suppressed, feared, and desired. And it is a chart that was going to find its life's work in the unconscious. And that's what he worked with, along with his friendship with Carl Gustav Jung. So he's Scorpio ascendant, which is 7 degrees. It can tell us how he met the world. Scorpio rising sees through surfaces instinctively, and it cannot be deceived, and it does not wish to be comfortable. It is orientated towards depth, toward power, towards the hidden dynamics underneath the polite social exterior. And that was the face of Freud that he presented to the world: penetrating, intense, probing, utterly uninterested in anything that was not essential and true. And when he looked at a patient, he was not looking at what they were saying, he was looking at what they were not saying, and what their dreams revealed, what slipped out in the gaps between words. And Scorpio rising is the natural analyst, the one who notices everything and reveals selectively. So it's quite interesting. So Scorpio rising, and his Pluto is opposing here. You can see 4 degrees. So although it doesn't look like that opposite there, but you can see that's 7 degrees and that's 4 degrees. This is because of these planets. It doesn't look equally across, but it's at 4 degrees, which is opposite to his ascendant. And his ascendant is opposite to his descendant. So what we've got is the cusp where other begins. So this is, you know, pre the 7th house, and it's where other becomes significant. It's one of the most structurally significant configurations in his chart. Pluto on the descendant means that transformation, depth, and power come to Freud through the encounter with other. So through relationship, through the therapeutic dyad. And his patients were not merely people seeking relief, they were the instrument through which Pluto spoke. The unconscious revealed itself in the consulting room, in the space between two people. And Freud, with Scorpio rising and Pluto on the descendant, was built to receive it. So now look at his sun here. That is at 16 degrees Taurus conjunct Uranus, you can see here. And that's his 7th house here. And the sun in the 7th is also in Carl Jung's configuration too, the identity fundamentally shaped through other. And this speaks to both men needing the mirror of another mind to fully know themselves and to fully express what they are. And also, you can see where your sun is in your chart, or if you know anybody who has their sun in the 7th house, and see what you make of other people who have that. But where Jung's sun was in Leo in the 7th, and radiant and Leonian and kingly, Freud's in Taurus is earthy, sensory, embodied, rooted in the physical world. And this is the key to understanding everything about Freud's framework, where Jung went upward into the archetypal, into the symbolic, into the spiritual and the numinous. Freud went downward into the body, into the drives, into eros and Thanatos, into the mouth, the anus, the genitals, the physical origins of psychic life. His Taurus sun demanded that the unconscious be grounded in the body and also in the earth, in the physical substrate of human experience. It could not be otherwise. And the sun conjunct Uranus, which we can see in Taurus, is revolutionary in the realm of the bodily and the relational. Uranus here in the 7th is the great disruptor of received wisdom about what the body means, what desire means, what the relationship between patient and doctor means. He invented the therapeutic relationship. He invented the concept of transference. That what happens between two people in the consulting room is not merely professional, but it is saturated with the whole history of their previous relationships, their earliest attachments, their most fundamental desires and fears. And you may have found that if you've ever had therapy yourself, like psychoanalysis, you may have experienced that yourself. The sun conjunct Uranus in the 7th in Taurus is the man who looked at relationship between bodies, as I've said, and the patient and the analyst, between child and parent, and found the entire structure of the human psyche hidden inside, which is true. You know, we have it all within us, everything we've ever experienced. His moon is also in Gemini, but it is in his 8th house there, and it is actually conjunct to Vertex. So I'll tell you a bit about that now. Gemini in the 8th house is one of the most telling placements of the whole chart. In his chart, the 8th house is the house of death, of sexuality, of the hidden, of transformation, and what lies beneath. And the moon means that Freud's emotional world, his inner life, his sense of what mattered, lived permanently in this territory. He was not someone who visited the 8th house as a guest. He was a native, and a Gemini moon in the 8th is the mind that cannot stop thinking about death and sexuality, because this is fundamentally what the 8th house is about. And that is in the interplay between them, you know, what we find in the interplay between them, the key to everything. His two great theatrical poles, Eros and Thanatos, the life drive and the death drive, are the Gemini moon in an 8th made into theory. Two forces and two drives, inseparable, entwined, and the mind, you know, flickering between them endlessly. I mean, Gemini does that anyway. I have a Gemini moon, and, you know, I'm continuously going backwards and forwards, but I have mine in the 7th house. So the vertex conjunct his moon here is profound. The vertex is the point of the fated encounter of what cannot be avoided. of the experiences that arrive that change everything. His vertex is conjunct his moon in the 8th house, and his fated encounters were always with the darkest, most unspeakable material. With the women in Vienna who came to him for their hysteria and their buried memories and their forbidden desires. With death itself, he lived with cancer for 16 years, 30 operations, and a prosthetic palate that made, if I'm saying that correct, that made eating and speaking agonizing. That must have been very difficult for him with the work he was doing as well. It must have been caused a lot of frustration, I would imagine. The vertex on the moon in the 8th did not allow him to keep death at a comfortable theatrical distance. He was living it, And then you see here, you've got Saturn at 27 degrees Gemini in the 8th house as well. You can see just here. And it's 14 degrees the moon, 27 degrees Saturn. So it's not quite a conjunction, but it's up there with Saturn as well. So Gemini in the 8th house, Saturn in Gemini in the 8th house adds structure, discipline, and weight to all of this moon and vertex material. Saturn in the 8th is the serious reckoning with mortality, with sexuality, with what must not be spoken. And in Gemini, it is the systematic construction of language from the unspeakable. Freud built an entire vocabulary around the ID, the ego, the superego, repression, projection, transference, and the different complexes, the Oedipus, and again, my spelling, but I'm sure everybody knows what I'm talking about, maybe, or maybe not. You can put in comments below. I'll put it below, actually, what he was saying in the comments in a pinned post so that you can get the idea if you're not sure what I'm talking about. So because Saturn is in the 8th in Gemini, demands that the hidden be named. So whatever was hidden had to be named, categorized, structured, and made speakable because it's in Gemini, yeah? And he created the talking cure. The cure was in the speaking. Saturn in Gemini in the 8th knew the language was the only tool that could reach into the territory and bring anything back. So also with dreams, he had a book that he wrote on dreams, which I'll mention shortly, which I read, the Interpretations of Dreams, which was written in 1900. Anyway, Saturn square Mars. So Saturn is square to his Mars here. So you can see Saturn in the 8th, and in the 11th, you've got his Mars in Libra. And that tension between structure and drive, between the disciplined framework and the raw libido energy, he was theorizing about. It appears throughout his life in the suppression and the sublimation of his own sexuality in the theatrical work. And Saturn squares his Jupiter. So Saturn is square to his Jupiter also down here. You can see that's quite tight square. And the tension between discipline and expansion, between the careful, contained clinical framework and the grand, ambitious sweep of his vision, because he was very visionary. He wanted to revolutionize the understanding of the entire human psyche, and also had how to build a scientific. He had to build a scientific institution rigorous enough to survive professional scrutiny. Saturn and Jupiter in permanent tension, the tension built around and in psychoanalysis. And there's a lot of tension around psychoanalysis today, as well, in our changing times. Mercury, as you can see, it's 27 degrees of Taurus here, and it's in the 7th house, is the instrument of all of it. Mercury trine Mars. So you can see here, Mercury is trine to his Mars, almost. And you can also see that it's sextile to Jupiter. So I'm looking at the aspects here. So sextile to Jupiter down here. You can see that is a square, almost just about, I mean, literally. So, and semi-sextile Saturn and Venus. So you've got a semi-sextile to Saturn and Venus. Saturn, and then he's Venus here as well. There you go. And then we have Mercury in service of the entire chart, connecting the drive, the expansion, and the structure, and the relational into one coherent speaking and writing capacity. And Freud was an extraordinary writer. His prose style was lucid, precise, and compulsively readable. And he won the Goethe Prize for Literature in 1930, notably not a scientific prize. His writing was always literature as much as it was science. Mercury in Taurus here in the 7th, writing about the body, the drives, the relationship between two people. There is a sensory groundedness to his prose, a weight and texture that reflects the Taurian quality of the Mercury placement. And then you've got Chiron, which is the wound. This is the 3rd house. It's 5 degrees and it's in Aquarius. And it's square to his Pluto, literally. So that's square to his Pluto. And if you see, the 3rd house is the domain of how we think and speak and process immediate reality, and under enormous transformative protonic pressure. So there was pressure there with that Chiron and the Pluto. Chiron in Aquarius in the 3rd is the wound around being the outsider, the revolutionary thinker whose ideas are received as dangerous. In his lifetime, Freud's work was dismissed, ridiculed, pathologized. He was accused of reducing all human experience to sexuality. In fact, when I think, I'm much more of a Jungian I love Jung, and I always sort of was not quite sure about Freud. But I did make myself read interpretations of dreams because I thought I just want to make sure I'm not missing something there and just projecting my own dislike onto something. Also, how we do that, like we have a feeling and we sort of just don't feel we gel with somebody or understand them. So I'm pleased that I did listen to it. I think it was about 27 hours. You can get it on Audible. And he was accused of reducing all human experience to sexuality. He was hounded out of Vienna by the Nazis who burned his books. And the outsider mind, the wound, you can see there, huge, the wound of the thought that was too radical for times to contain. And Chiron square Pluto means that the wound was also the source of the most transformative thinking of his era. So Chiron is wherever that wound is in our own chart, that is where we've got something to transform. And that's why it's important to look at the aspects and then also the transiting Chiron as we move through life. The transit of Chiron is about 50 years roughly. So then he's got Lilith. I like to use Lilith up here. So Lilith up there in the 11th house as well in Libra, and it's trine to his moon. So when we look at his moon, we can see his moon is here. So that's a trine. And also it's conjunct his Mars. This is, quite extraordinary, really, conjunct his Mars as well. You can see here. And Lilith, the archetypal feminine principle that refuses to submit, refuses to be domesticated or silenced, refusing to lie beneath, sitting in Libra, the sign of relationship and of civilized social exchange in the 11th house of collective society and community, and conjunct Mars retrograde. And that's the interesting thing there, that I noticed that he did have Mars retrograde. So if we look at his other planets, he doesn't have, from what I looked at, excuse these symbols, I use these ones for my own learning and development, so I'm not going to go into those, but you can see that Saturn, and we look at Mercury is direct, and we look at Uranus is direct, and Pluto is direct, and Neptune is direct. So to have Mars retrograde is really interesting. And we know it's conjunct Lilith, the Mars retrograde. Mars retrograde in the 11th is the internalized turned inward drive energy, the libido that circulates back into itself rather than moving freely outward. And Freud theorized the libido. He made the suppression and redirection of the drive energy the central mechanism of civilization itself. And Mars retrograde conjunct Lilith in Libra. It's a man who found in the relationship between repressed sexuality and social life the key to understanding everything about human culture, civilization, and its discontents in Mars retrograde conjunct Lilith in Libra. And he made it into a book. So Lilith is trine to his moon. So you get Lilith trine over here to his moon. And he's Chiron in the third also, and trine his Chiron in the third. So you look here, and it's trine to his Chiron in the third house, which is quite useful. And that Lilith energy is really useful for us, and where we can, be quite raw and develop and become mature in wisdom as well. Like the old crone, it's like the wisdom that steps forth. And so we have the 8th house and the wounded communicating mind. And did I lose something there? The 8th house and the wounded communicating mind. The women who came to him, the hysterics, Anna Odora, the case he built his theory upon, where in many ways the embodiment of what Lilith trine moon in the 8th describes. Women in whom something wild and unspeakable was trying to speak through the body because there was nowhere else for it to go. So Neptune at 19 degrees of Pisces, you can see here, just there, 19 degrees, and it's in the 5th house as well, conjunct his Jupiter, just here. And there's a bit of a gap there by 10 degrees, but it is, it could be seen as a conjunction. The 5th house is creativity, play, the imagination, and Neptune here in its own sign dissolves the boundaries between conscious and unconscious fantasy entirely. The 5th house is where we play, and Neptune in Pisces in the 5th means the play of the imagination leads directly into the deepest waters of the unconscious. So his great work, which is the book I read, The Interpretation of Dreams, published deliberately as 1900 to mark the new century, argued that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, that in the apparently nonsensical imagery of dreams lay the disguised fulfillment of wishes too dangerous to acknowledge in waking life. For me, I would say dreams are where we're integrating stuff as well. So I don't think it's just, where we are looking for fulfillment. It's, where we are figuring stuff out. We can have reoccurring dreams, and people can have themes based on their childhood or on trauma. So often as we're integrating through life, these dreams do develop and change. But he believed they were the royal road to the unconscious, which I believe they are. If we understand what's going on, if we do remember our dreams, they can be very helpful as a healing capacity for us. And then they can be disguised fulfillment of wishes too dangerous to acknowledge in waking life, which is true to some degree as well. Neptune in Pisces in the 5th is for the man, for whom the imagination's nocturnal productions held the secret of everything. Jupiter conjunct Neptune here. I know that's a big gap though, so it's weaker than it would be if it was in an exact conjunction. It expands, makes it a grand and generous philosophical framework rather than a narrow clinical observation. The whole of human mythology, religion, and art and culture could be read through the same lens, and the unconscious was not just in the consulting room, it was everywhere. And it is everywhere. The unconscious is everywhere, all the way around us. And Neptune square his moon in the 8th. So you see here, you've got the moon and you've got Neptune down here. And Neptune square his moon in the 8th, the emotional world flooded by the irrational, the boundary between sleep and waking, between fantasy and memory, between what we know we want and what we discover we want, permanently permeable. He could not have built a theory of the unconscious if he did not live it. And Neptune square moon in the 8th is an inner world saturated with precisely the material he spent his life, working the theorizing. And Venus is at 26 degrees Aries. So we go to Venus, which is here, 26 degrees of Aries, conjunct the North Node at 24 degrees of Aries in his 6th house. And the 6th house is service of daily work, of the body, and its maintenance, of the devotion of skill. And his North Node, his soul's evolutionary direction, sits on the 6th house, meaning his deepest purpose was always rooted in the daily disciplined work of service, not grand gesture, the individual patient, the case study, the hour by hour labour of sitting across from another individual and listening closely as any human being had ever listened before. Venus conjunct the North Node in Aries in the 6th says that this service carried the Venetian qualities of relationship and care, and that the Aries quality brought courage, the courage to hear and to say what no one before him had dared to say. Now, his midheaven is 19 degrees of Leo, and that's his public legacy with regal clarity. Leo on the midheaven, the king of the domain, the one whose authority in their field is not questioned, even when they're controversial. And you can see that his midheaven is trine Venus almost here. We've got a trine going on there. And we've got the one whose authority in the field is not questioned, even when they are controversial. MC trine Venus, MC trine the node as well, because they're conjunct. His public legacy was always going to be built through the work he was destined to do. And the midheaven conjunct trine his North Node by sign speaks to the ultimate alignment between his evolutionary and soul direction, what he publicly became known for. And the part of fortune, which I don't really go into often, but this is in Sagittarius in the 1st house. And his fortune lay in his own philosophical vision, his own capacity for expansive truth-seeking, Sagittarius, yeah. His own direct encounter with the world through his ascendant, which would be the Scorpio rising. And the part of fortune was always already in him, in his nature, in the way he brought his entire philosophical drive to bear on the very first and most personal house of the chart. And when you hold the whole chart together, if you look at his whole chart together here and see the different things going on, then this is a picture that emerges of a man who was constitutionally orientated towards the hidden. Scorpio rising could not be satisfied with surfaces, and Pluto on the descendant found transformation through other. The moon conjunct vertex in 8, which we got up here, lives permanently in the territory of death and desire. Neptune in Pisces down here, and in the 5th, turned imagination into theory. Saturn in Gemini in the 8th up here built a language that for what could not be spoken. And Mars retrograde conjunct Lilith here in the 11th turned suppressed drive energy into the key to understanding civilization itself. He was not a comfortable man. He was not a gentle man. Not saying a gentleman, gentle. He could be ruthless with those who disagreed with him. His relationship with Jung ended in a rupture that neither of them ever fully recovered from, and Freud's insistence that Jung submit to the primacy of sexuality as the foundation of the unconscious was a demand of a man who could not afford to be wrong. So, we meet people that they just think they're right all the time. Doesn't mean who's right, who is wrong. It's just that we've all got different ways of looking at things. And then the unconscious demand of a man who could not afford to be wrong. And Scorpio rising with Pluto on the descendant does not share power easily. And yet, without Freud, there would be no Jung. And this is the thing why we all need each other, even in the unpleasant interactions we have and without the edifice he built, however imperfect, however in need of revision, there is no framework for anyone who came after him to either stand on or push against. So he died in London on September 23rd, 1939, 3 weeks after the Second World War began. The century he had wanted to inaugurate with the publication of the Interpretations of Dreams was unraveling into its most catastrophic violence. His jaw was destroyed. He asked Max Schur, his physician, to keep the promise they had made. Schur administered morphine and Freud died in his sleep. And Neptune in Pisces in the fifth house, Jupiter beside it, the dissolution into the great oceanic unconscious from which he had spent his entire life drawing, the man who found the royal road to the unconscious and walked it until there was nothing left to walk. I did visit his house. It's in Hampstead, the one he lived in London, and then his daughter, I believe, continued living there. But it's a very interesting chart to look at. I think there's a lot of sadness as well around, the way that his last years were very challenging. And I've got a lot of respect for that time period because a lot of people got so much done. I mean, it's just incredible. To travel would have taken so much longer, the writing, the publications, all of the different things that people, committed to and did, and to hopefully make the world into a better place. So we have things now that, because of the people of the past, that clearly once they're gone, they're just a memory, or we read about them. And I hope that's useful to you. If you want me to look at your chart with you, then you can look at my website. The information is below in the description. Thanks for watching.